What if the oldest stories humanity ever recorded weren't myths at all, but memories? What if the clay tablets buried beneath the sands of ancient Mesopotamia contain not legends of gods and heroes, but actual testimonies of a world that existed before everything we think we know began? Tonight, we're stepping into one of history's most compelling mysteries, a puzzle that challenges everything archaeologists thought they understood about the birth of civilization itself. Because deep beneath the Iraqi desert, among fragments of baked clay covered in wedge-shaped marks, lies evidence that the Sumerians weren't telling stories about the distant past. They were keeping records. Before we dive deeper into this archaeological rabbit hole, hit that subscribe button if you're fascinated by the kind of history they don't teach in textbooks, and drop a comment letting me know what time zone you're watching from. There's something profound about exploring these ancient mysteries together, no matter where we are in the world. The story begins with a contradiction that has puzzled scholars for over a century. When archaeologists first started excavating Sumerian sites in the late 1800s, they expected to find exactly what you'd expect from humanity's first civilization: crude beginnings, trial and error, the messy, gradual development from simple stone tools to basic agriculture to primitive writing. Instead, they found something that defied every assumption about how civilizations are supposed to develop. The Sumerians appeared in history already advanced, not struggling with basic concepts, but wielding sophisticated mathematics, astronomical knowledge, and engineering capabilities that shouldn't have existed yet. Their cities weren't chaotic settlements of people learning to live together. They were geometrically planned, astronomically aligned, and built with precision that bordered on the impossible. Consider this unsettling fact. The earliest Sumerian mathematical tablets don't show them learning to count or figuring out basic arithmetic. They show them using complex formulas, calculating square roots, and working with mathematical concepts that other civilizations wouldn't develop for thousands of years. Their astronomical records tracked planetary cycles with accuracy that we've only recently been able to verify with modern telescopes. This wasn't gradual development. This was inheritance. The Sumerians themselves seemed to understand this. Their own records, carved into thousands of clay tablets, repeatedly state that civilization didn't begin with them. It was restored through them. They described themselves not as inventors, but as the inheritors of knowledge that came from somewhere else, from the time before the Great Flood that divided their history into two distinct eras. According to their most sacred historical document, known today as the Sumerian King List, there were 8 kings who ruled before the flood came. These weren't ordinary rulers. The tablets record their reigns not in years or decades, but in tens of thousands of years. Alulim, the first king, supposedly ruled for 28,800 years. Alagar ruled for 36,000 years. The numbers seem impossible until you realize they might not be measuring individual lifespans at all, but entire epochs of time. Then the tablets record a single, devastating line that changes everything. The flood swept over. After that moment, according to Sumerian records, everything changed. The impossible reigns ended. Mortality returned. Kings began ruling for hundreds of years, then decades, then normal human lifespans. The age of the gods had ended, and the age of mortals had begun. But here's what makes this more than just ancient mythology. The geological evidence supports the idea that something catastrophic actually happened. Throughout Mesopotamia, archaeologists have found distinct layers of flood sediment dating to roughly the same period. The Sumerians claim their great flood occurred clean, sterile silt deposited suddenly, separating older burned settlements from newer construction built on top. This same pattern appears not just in one location, but across multiple ancient sites. The cities of Ur, Kish, and Shuruppak all show evidence of massive flooding, followed by cultural rebuilding. Something genuinely devastating swept across this region around 2900 BCE, and the survivors remembered it for thousands of years. What makes the Sumerian flood account particularly compelling is how it differs from later versions. Unlike the biblical story of Noah or other flood myths that focus on divine punishment, the Sumerian account reads more like a disaster report, clinical, detailed, almost bureaucratic in its precision. They weren't creating a moral tale about the consequences of sin. They were documenting what actually happened to their world. The hero of their flood story wasn't called Noah, but Ziusudra, whose name means life of long days. According to the tablets, he was warned by the god Enki, who couldn't bear to see all knowledge perish with humanity. Enki instructed Ziusudra to build a vessel and preserve not just animals, but craftsmen, musicians, and scribes, the keepers of knowledge, the bearers of civilization itself. This detail reveals something crucial about how the Sumerians understood their own history. They believed the flood didn't just threaten human life, it threatened human knowledge. Everything that made civilization possible was at risk of being lost forever. The flood wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a cultural apocalypse. When we examine what the Sumerians claim to have inherited from this pre-flood world, the picture becomes even more intriguing. Their language, for instance, has no known relatives in the entire history of human speech. Sumerian stands completely alone, linguistically isolated, as if it had been transplanted from somewhere else entirely. Linguists have spent over a century trying to connect it to other language families. Every attempt has failed. Their mathematical system was based on the number 60 rather than 10, which seems arbitrary until you realize that 60 has more factors than any smaller number. It's perfect for astronomy, geometry, and complex calculations. We still use their base 60 system today in our measurements of time and angles, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These aren't natural human choices. They're inherited Sumerian standards that were so useful they survived the collapse of their entire civilization. Perhaps most remarkably, their astronomical knowledge included observations that should have taken generations to accumulate. They tracked the precise orbital period of Venus, mapped the movements of Jupiter and Saturn, and understood precessional cycles that take nearly 26,000 years to complete. How could the first civilization already possess this kind of long-term astronomical data unless they were inheriting it from observers who had been watching the skies for much longer? The physical artifacts tell the same strange story. Bronze tools appear in Sumerian sites centuries before the supposed Bronze Age in that region. There's no evidence of the trial and error period you'd expect as people learn to work with metal alloys. The tools show up already perfected, as if the knowledge of metallurgy had been passed down complete rather than developed gradually. Even more puzzling are the cylinder seals found throughout Sumerian sites. These small stone cylinders, carved with intricate designs, were rolled across wet clay to create official marks and signatures. But some of the images they contain seem to depict mechanical devices, gears, pulleys, and complex machinery that shouldn't have existed in a pre-industrial society. Either the Sumerians had access to technology we don't understand, or they were copying images from somewhere else, images of tools and machines from the world that existed before the flood. The deeper archaeologists have dug into Sumerian sites, the more the mystery has deepened. At Eridu, considered the oldest Sumerian city, excavations have revealed layer upon layer of temple construction, stretching back nearly 8,000 years. But the oldest structures aren't primitive experiments. They're already sophisticated, built with precise astronomical alignments and advanced engineering techniques. Each temple was built directly on top of the previous one, as if maintaining continuity with something sacred that had been established long before. This pattern of building on top of older, more advanced foundations appears throughout Sumerian archaeology. It's the opposite of what we'd expect from a developing civilization. Instead of growing more sophisticated over time, Sumerian construction seems to grow simpler, as if they were working from increasingly faded blueprints of something they could no longer fully understand. The Sumerians themselves explained this pattern in their records. They wrote that civilization, kingship, and sacred knowledge had descended from heaven. Not metaphorically, but as historical fact. They described beings they called the Anunnaki, who came from the sky and taught humanity the arts of civilization, agriculture, writing, law, astronomy, mathematics, metallurgy. Everything needed to build a complex society. Whether these Anunnaki were gods, advanced humans from a pre-flood civilization, or something else entirely, the Sumerians treated them as real historical figures. They recorded genealogies, described their interactions with humans, and built temples specifically designed as landing places for their return. The famous ziggurats that dotted Mesopotamian cities weren't just religious monuments. They were constructed as physical bridges between earth and sky, platforms where divine beings could descend. This brings us to perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the Sumerian records. They consistently describe the pre-flood world not as primitive, but as more advanced than their own time. The kings before the flood didn't just live longer, they possessed greater knowledge, commanded more sophisticated technology, and maintained direct communication with divine teachers. The flood didn't end a dark age, it ended a golden age. Everything that came after was reconstruction, not original construction. The question this raises is profound. If the Sumerians were right, if they really were inheritors rather than inventors, then what kind of world existed before the Great Flood? What level of knowledge and technology was lost when those ancient coastlines disappeared beneath rising seas at the end of the last ice age? Modern archaeology is beginning to uncover evidence that human civilization might be far older than we previously believed. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, built over 11,000 years ago by people who were supposedly simple hunter-gatherers, required sophisticated planning, advanced stoneworking techniques, and the ability to organize large workforces. Underwater ruins off the coasts of India, Japan, and the Mediterranean suggest complex settlements that were submerged when sea levels rose after the Ice Age. Could there have been advanced civilizations living on the continental shelves that were exposed during the Ice Age? Civilizations with knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and engineering that was passed down to survivors like those who eventually established Sumerian culture. The possibility is becoming harder to dismiss as more evidence accumulates. The Sumerian records might not be mythology at all. They might be the last surviving testimony of a lost world, a civilization that developed over thousands of years on coastlines that are now hundreds of feet underwater. When the Ice Age ended and the seas rose, most of this world would have been erased. Only those who fled inland, who carried fragments of the old knowledge, would have survived to pass on the memory. If this interpretation is correct, then the Sumerians weren't the beginning of human civilization. They were the end of something much older, the final chapter of a story that started long before the floodwaters came. What happened to all that knowledge? How does an entire civilization's worth of accumulated wisdom simply vanish from history? The Sumerian tablets provide us with clues, but they also reveal something deeply unsettling about the fragility of human memory itself. Consider how knowledge was preserved in the ancient world. There were no printing presses, no digital storage, no mass distribution systems. Everything depended on direct transmission from teacher to student, from master craftsman to apprentice, from priest to initiate. Complex knowledge required not just individual memory, but institutional continuity, schools, temples, workshops, where techniques could be practiced and refined across generations. When a catastrophe destroys those institutions, when the carriers of specialized knowledge perish, entire fields of understanding can disappear almost overnight. This isn't theoretical. We've seen it happen repeatedly throughout history. The Library of Alexandria burning, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire taking with it centuries of accumulated engineering knowledge, the Spanish conquest of the Americas destroying vast repositories of astronomical and mathematical understanding that we're only now beginning to appreciate. But the flood described in Sumerian records wasn't just another historical catastrophe. According to their accounts, it was total, a reset button pressed on human civilization itself. And yet somehow fragments survived, seeds of the old knowledge that took root in the minds of survivors and slowly grew into what we recognize as Sumerian culture. The tablets describe this preservation process in fascinating detail. They speak of the ME, which scholars translate as divine decrees or sacred ordinances. But the concept seems more complex than that. The ME weren't laws or commandments. They were templates, blueprints, fundamental principles that governed everything from kingship and priesthood to metallurgy and music. According to Sumerian mythology, these ME were kept by the god Enki in the depths beneath the earth and could only be transmitted to humanity through divine will or occasionally clever theft. In one famous story, the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu and tricks Enki into giving her the me while he's intoxicated. She loads them onto her boat and sails back to Uruk, bringing civilization with her. When Enki realizes what he's done, he tries to retrieve them, but Inanna has already crossed the boundary. The knowledge has been released into the human world. It's a strange myth, but it carries within it a sophisticated understanding of how knowledge actually transfers between cultures. It doesn't happen automatically. It requires active effort, sometimes deception, sometimes force. And once knowledge crosses certain boundaries, it becomes almost impossible to contain again. This might be exactly what happened during and after the Great Flood. As the old world drowned, desperate efforts were made to preserve what could be saved, not just physical objects, but the intellectual frameworks that made civilization possible. Mathematical principles, astronomical observations, engineering techniques, agricultural methods, the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years compressed into whatever forms could survive the transition. Some of this knowledge may have been encoded in ways we're only beginning to understand. Recent analysis of Sumerian hymns has revealed mathematical ratios embedded in their structure. The number of syllables per line, the repetition of certain sounds, the rhythm of stressed and unstressed beats, all follow patterns that correspond to harmonic intervals in music, the same ratios the Sumerians used in their architecture and astronomical calculations. It's as if their language itself was designed as a storage medium for mathematical concepts. Not just words, but an encoding system that could preserve numerical relationships across generations, even if the specific meaning was temporarily lost. When you sing a hymn correctly, you're automatically reproducing mathematical formulas, whether you understand them or not. This suggests that the preservation of pre-flood knowledge wasn't random. It was systematic, careful. Desperate survivors working to ensure that nothing essential would be lost, encoding vital information into stories, songs, and rituals that could survive even if formal education systems collapsed. The Sumerian King List itself might be one of these encoding systems. Those impossible reign lengths that seem so mythological start to make more sense when you realize they're all multiples of 3,600, a number the Sumerians called the Shah. In their cosmology, the Shah wasn't just a unit of time. It was a celestial cycle, the period it took for certain planetary alignments to return to their starting positions. The pre-flood kings might not have been individuals at all. They might have been symbolic representations of astronomical epochs. Alulim's reign of 28,800 years equals exactly 8 Shahs. Alagar's reign of 36,000 years equals 10 Shahs. The pattern continues throughout the list. These weren't lifespans. They were astronomical codes, a way of preserving knowledge about long-term celestial cycles in the form of a historical narrative. When viewed this way, the King List becomes something much more sophisticated than mythology. It's a mnemonic device, a way of encoding complex astronomical data into a story format that could be memorized and transmitted orally, even if the writing system was lost. The reign lengths serve as a backup storage system for knowledge that was considered too valuable to risk losing. This interpretation aligns with what we know about how oral cultures preserve technical information. Australian Aboriginal peoples have maintained detailed geographical and astronomical knowledge for tens of thousands of years through songlines and dreamtime stories. Polynesian navigators encoded precise sailing directions into myths and chants that could guide voyagers across thousands of miles of open ocean. The same techniques that allowed these cultures to preserve knowledge across millennia could have allowed flood survivors to preserve fragments of a more advanced civilization. But there's another layer to this mystery that goes beyond simple knowledge preservation. The Sumerian texts don't just describe the survival of information, they describe the survival of beings. The Anunnaki, those mysterious figures who supposedly descended from heaven to teach humanity, appear throughout Sumerian records not as distant gods, but as active participants in human affairs. They're described with unusual specificity for mythological figures. Enki, the keeper of knowledge, taught agriculture and healing arts. Enlil controlled law and order. Anu governed cosmic principles. These weren't abstract concepts personified as deities. They were described as individuals with distinct personalities, relationships, and areas of expertise. The tablets record their genealogies, their conflicts with each other, their interactions with human rulers. Most intriguingly, they're described as having physical forms. Radiant, yes, but corporeal. They eat food prepared by human servants. They sleep in temples built specifically for their use. They travel in vessels that the Sumerians struggled to describe but tried to depict on cylinder seals. Strange cylindrical objects that gleamed like bronze and moved through the sky. Who were these beings? The traditional interpretation sees them as nature gods, personifications of natural forces like storms, fertility, and celestial bodies. But that explanation struggles to account for the technical knowledge they supposedly transmitted. Teaching humans to smelt bronze, to calculate planetary orbits, to build irrigation systems, these aren't the kinds of skills you'd expect from personified natural forces. Another possibility is that the Anunnaki were simply human survivors from the pre-flood civilization. People who possessed advanced knowledge and technology that seemed godlike to the scattered tribes trying to rebuild in the aftermath of the catastrophe. When you've lost everything and someone appears with knowledge of metallurgy, astronomy, and engineering, they might well seem divine. This interpretation gains support from flood myths found throughout the world. Almost every ancient culture has stories of wise beings who appeared after a great deluge to teach the arts of civilization. The seven sages of Hindu tradition, the watchers of Hebrew texts, the Viracocha of Andean peoples, Kukulkan of Mesoamerican cultures. The specific names and details vary, but the pattern remains remarkably consistent. Knowledgeable beings appearing after a catastrophic flood to help humanity rebuild. If these stories share a common origin, if they're all fragmentary memories of the same historical events, then the Anunnaki might have been the last representatives of the pre-flood world. Survivors who retained enough knowledge to seem like gods to those who had lost everything, but who were ultimately still human, still mortal, still bound by the limitations of their time. The gradual withdrawal of the Anunnaki from Sumerian records might reflect a natural process. As their knowledge was transmitted to human students, as new generations learned the skills necessary for civilization, the original teachers would have become less necessary. Eventually they would have died out, leaving behind only the institutions, traditions, and knowledge systems they had helped establish. This would explain why later Mesopotamian cultures maintained the memory of the Anunnaki, but increasingly described them as distant, less involved in daily human affairs, not because they had ascended to some higher realm, but because they had simply passed away, leaving humanity to carry on with the civilization they had helped rebuild. The ziggurats, those massive step towers that dominated Mesopotamian cities, might have been built as monuments to this transition. Not stairways to heaven, but memorials to the time when heaven and earth were connected, when divine knowledge flowed freely to humanity. when the carriers of pre-flood wisdom still walked among the survivors. The small temples at the top of each ziggurat, furnished with beds and tables as if waiting for divine visitors, weren't just ritual spaces. They were expressions of hope, perhaps even denial, a refusal to accept that the age of direct divine instruction was over, that humanity was now truly on its own, with only fragments of the old knowledge to guide them. Understanding the Sumerian records this way transforms our entire perspective on early human history. Instead of seeing civilization as a gradual climb from primitive beginnings, we begin to see it as recovery from catastrophic loss. Every achievement, every innovation, every breakthrough becomes not a step forward into unknown territory, but a step back towards something that had existed before and been lost. The implications are staggering. If advanced civilizations existed before the great floods that marked the end of the last ice age, then human history is far longer and more complex than we've imagined. We're not the first technological society. We might not even be the second or third. We're simply the latest in a series of human civilizations that have risen, flourished, and been swept away by forces beyond their control. This perspective casts our own technological achievements in a different light. The computers we've built, the satellites we've launched, the knowledge we've accumulated, all of it rests on foundations that might be more fragile than we realize. Climate change, nuclear war, asteroid impact, any number of catastrophes could reset human civilization just as completely as the flood that ended the pre-Sumerian world. The question becomes not whether such a reset could happen, but whether we're prepared for it. Have we encoded our most essential knowledge in forms that could survive the collapse of our technological infrastructure? Could future archaeologists, digging through the ruins of our cities, piece together enough fragments to rebuild what we've created? The Sumerians, at least, tried. They pressed their knowledge into clay, baked it hard, and buried it deep. 5,000 years later, we're still reading their tablets, still learning from their observations, still using mathematical and astronomical concepts they preserved from an even older world. Perhaps that's the real message hidden in the Sumerian records. Not that civilization is permanent, but that knowledge can survive its collapse if we're careful enough, systematic enough, desperate enough to preserve it properly. The flood may sweep away cities and kill populations, but ideas, encoded correctly, can float on the surface until someone is ready to fish them out and begin again. The cuneiform tablets scattered across museum collections worldwide aren't just historical artifacts. They're survival manuals, written by people who understood exactly what it meant to lose everything and had to figure out how to rebuild from fragments. In studying them, we're not just learning about the past, we're learning about resilience, about preservation, about the eternal human struggle to maintain knowledge in the face of inevitable catastrophe. And perhaps, if we listen carefully enough to what they're trying to tell us, we might even learn how to do it better than they did, how to create systems of knowledge storage and transmission that could survive not just floods, but any disaster our species might face. The Sumerians saved fragments of one lost world. The question is whether we're wise enough to save ours. But there's another dimension to this mystery that archaeologists have only recently begun to understand. The Sumerians weren't just preserving knowledge from a lost civilization, they were actively trying to reconnect with it. And the evidence for this lies not in what they wrote, but in how they built. Walk through the ruins of any major Sumerian city today, and you'll notice something peculiar. The layout isn't random. Streets intersect at precise angles. Buildings are positioned according to mathematical ratios. Entire urban centers seem to follow blueprints that encode astronomical data directly into their architecture. This wasn't accidental city planning. This was deliberate communication with the sky. The city of Nippur, considered the religious heart of ancient Sumer, sits at the center of a network of settlements arranged in distances that correspond to musical intervals. Not approximately. Exactly. The spacing between major Sumerian cities reflects the same harmonic ratios they used in their mathematics and embedded in their hymns. It's as if they were trying to tune the entire landscape like a massive instrument. Why would anyone do this? The answer might lie in their understanding of what they had lost. According to their tablets, the pre-flood world hadn't just possessed advanced technology. It had operated according to principles that unified science, spirituality, and consciousness in ways we can barely comprehend. The flood didn't just destroy buildings and kill people. It shattered a fundamental connection between human awareness and cosmic order. The Sumerians believed this connection could be restored, but only through precise reconstruction of the original patterns. Every temple had to be built on the exact spot where older temples had stood. Every ritual had to follow the ancient formulas exactly. Every city had to echo the celestial harmonies that once allowed direct communication between earth and heaven. This obsession with precision explains why Sumerian culture seems so rigid, so focused on maintaining traditions without deviation. They weren't being conservative for its own sake. They were trying to rebuild a cosmic machine, and they knew that even small errors could prevent it from functioning properly. Consider the ziggurat at Ur, one of the best preserved examples of this technology. Recent surveys using ground-penetrating radar have revealed that it sits atop a complex network of underground chambers and channels. These aren't storage rooms or burial vaults. They're acoustic resonance chambers designed to amplify and focus sound waves in specific directions. The entire structure functions as a massive stone instrument, capable of producing frequencies that can be felt as much as heard. But here's where it gets really interesting. When researchers mapped the acoustic properties of the ziggurat, they discovered that it's tuned to the same frequencies that appear in Sumerian mathematical tablets. The building itself is a physical manifestation of their numerical systems. You can literally walk through their mathematics, experiencing abstract concepts as three-dimensional space. Similar patterns appear at other Sumerian sites. The temple complex at Eridu contains chambers with walls that resonate at frequencies corresponding to planetary orbital periods. The spacing between pillars at Uruk matches the ratios used in their astronomical calculations. These weren't just buildings. They were machines designed to recreate the harmonic relationships that supposedly governed the pre-flood world. The Sumerians called this technology the ME, those divine principles we discussed earlier. But modern analysis suggests the ME weren't just abstract concepts. They were specific vibrational frequencies, mathematical relationships that could be encoded into physical structures and activated through sound, movement, and focused attention. This interpretation transforms our understanding of Sumerian religious practices. Those elaborate rituals performed by priests weren't just symbolic ceremonies. They were operating procedures for cosmic machinery. The chants had to be sung at exact pitches. The movements had to follow precise patterns. The offerings had to be placed in specific locations at calculated times. Everything was designed to generate the frequencies that would supposedly reopen communication with the divine realm. Did it work? The Sumerian records suggest that sometimes, yes. They describe occasions when the gods did descend, when direct communication was re-established, when knowledge flowed freely from heaven to earth. But these events became increasingly rare over time, as if the machinery was slowly breaking down, the connections growing weaker with each passing generation. By the time Babylon rose to prominence, inheriting Sumerian traditions, the technology seems to have been largely forgotten. The rituals continued, but more as cultural memory than functional practice. The ziggurats were maintained, but their acoustic properties were no longer understood. The knowledge was becoming mythologized, transformed from technical manual into religious doctrine. This degradation of understanding helps explain one of the most puzzling aspects of Mesopotamian history. How could civilizations that built such sophisticated structures, that possessed such advanced knowledge, gradually become less capable over time? The answer might be that they weren't developing this technology themselves. They were operating inherited systems that they understood imperfectly and couldn't fully maintain. Think of it like finding a computer in the ruins of a destroyed city. You might learn to turn it on, to run basic programs, even to perform some useful functions. But without understanding the underlying principles of electronics, programming, and digital logic, you couldn't repair it when it broke down, couldn't upgrade its capabilities, couldn't build new computers to replace it when it finally failed. The Sumerians found themselves in a similar position with the remnants of pre-flood technology. They could operate some of it, could maintain certain functions, could even achieve remarkable results. But the deeper understanding was missing. They were users, not creators, inheritors of tools they couldn't fully comprehend. This explains why their own technological development seems so limited compared to their inherited capabilities. They never invented the wheel for transportation, relying instead on sledges and rollers for moving heavy objects. They never developed sophisticated metallurgy beyond bronze, never created mechanical devices more complex than simple tools, yet they somehow possessed astronomical knowledge that required advanced mathematics and observational instruments we can't identify in the archaeological record. The pattern suggests they were working with two completely different technological traditions, their own gradual development from Stone Age foundations and inherited systems from the pre-flood civilization that operated on principles they couldn't duplicate. Over time, as the inherited technology degraded beyond repair, they were left with only their own, more primitive capabilities. But they never stopped trying to bridge that gap. Throughout their history, you find evidence of attempts to reverse engineer the old technology to rediscover the principles that made it function. The most ambitious of these projects was the Tower of Babel, that legendary structure that supposedly challenged heaven itself. According to Mesopotamian records, this wasn't a single building, but an entire complex designed to recreate the original connection between earth and sky. Not just a ziggurat, but a massive machine incorporating every aspect of Sumerian astronomical, mathematical, and acoustic knowledge. The ultimate attempt to rebuild what the flood had destroyed. The Hebrew Bible describes it as an act of hubris, divine punishment for human arrogance. But Mesopotamian sources tell a different story. They describe it as humanity's greatest engineering project, a desperate attempt to restore the golden age when gods walked among mortals, and knowledge flowed freely from heaven to earth. The project failed, but not because of divine intervention. It failed because the knowledge needed to complete it had been too thoroughly lost. The builders could construct the physical structure, but they couldn't recreate the harmonic relationships that would make it functional. They had the blueprints, but not the understanding, the form, but not the essence. The confusion of languages that supposedly ended the project might have been a natural result of this failure. When a massive engineering project collapses due to fundamental misunderstandings about how it's supposed to work, the various teams working on it would naturally begin to blame each other, to develop conflicting theories about what went wrong, to fragment into separate groups pursuing different solutions. Over time, these fragments would have developed their own technical vocabularies, their own theoretical frameworks, their own approaches to the same underlying problems. The single unified knowledge system that had once allowed the pre-flood civilization to function would have splintered into dozens of incompatible traditions, each preserving pieces of the original truth, but none maintaining the complete picture. This fragmentation explains why flood myths appear in so many different cultures worldwide, but with such different details. They're all memories of the same events, but filtered through different linguistic and cultural traditions that developed in isolation from each other. Each group of survivors took their fragment of the story and developed it according to their own limited understanding. The Sumerians were unique because they maintained more of the original framework than most other post-flood cultures. Their language preserved more of the technical vocabulary. Their mathematics retained more of the underlying principles. Their architecture incorporated more of the harmonic relationships. They were closer to the source, but still far enough removed that complete restoration was impossible. This might be why they obsessively documented everything. They sensed that knowledge was slipping away, that each generation understood slightly less than the one before. Their massive archives of clay tablets weren't just record-keeping. They were desperate attempts to preserve whatever could still be saved before it vanished entirely. Modern archaeology is beginning to confirm this pattern of knowledge loss over time. Analysis of Sumerian tablets shows that mathematical precision actually decreased over the centuries. Early astronomical observations are more accurate than later ones. Architectural techniques became simpler rather than more sophisticated. It's as if they were watching their own capabilities diminish, helpless to prevent the slow erosion of inherited wisdom. But they also developed something new in response to this crisis. A systematic approach to knowledge preservation that would influence every subsequent civilization. They created schools, libraries, standardized curricula. They developed copying protocols that ensured accurate transmission of texts across generations. They established professional scribal classes whose entire purpose was maintaining intellectual continuity. These innovations were born from the trauma of nearly losing everything. The Sumerians understood, in a way that we're only beginning to appreciate, how fragile human knowledge really is. They had lived through the ultimate catastrophe and seen how quickly thousands of years of accumulated wisdom could disappear. Their response was to create redundant systems, multiple backup copies, institutional structures that could survive individual disasters. In doing so, they invented the concept of civilization as conscious knowledge preservation. Not just the accumulation of individual discoveries, but the systematic maintenance of collective understanding across time. Every subsequent culture that developed writing, formal education, and institutional memory was building on foundations the Sumerians established in their desperate race against forgetting. This might be their most important legacy, not the specific knowledge they preserved, but the methods they developed for preserving knowledge itself. The recognition that human understanding is not naturally cumulative, that without deliberate effort it will degrade and disappear, that maintaining civilization requires constant vigilance against the entropy that destroyed the world before the flood. We face similar challenges today. Our own knowledge systems are more complex, but potentially more fragile than anything the Sumerians created. Digital storage degrades. Computer languages become obsolete. Institutional knowledge walks out the door when experts retire. We've created incredible capabilities, but we haven't necessarily created the kind of robust preservation systems that could survive a major disruption. The Sumerians pressed their most important knowledge into clay because clay, properly fired, can last for millennia. What medium are we using to preserve the knowledge future generations will need to rebuild if our technological civilization collapses? Are we encoding it in forms that could survive electromagnetic pulses, climate catastrophe, social breakdown? Perhaps more importantly, are we teaching the preservation mindset that allowed Sumerian knowledge to survive the destruction of their entire world? The understanding that knowledge is not permanent, that it requires active effort to maintain, that forgetting is the default state unless we consciously choose to remember. The cuneiform tablets buried beneath Iraqi sands weren't just ancient records. They were messages in bottles, cast into the ocean of time by people who understood exactly what we stand to lose. In studying them, we're not just learning about the past, we're learning about the future, about what it takes to ensure that human knowledge survives whatever catastrophes lie ahead. The Sumerians succeeded in their mission. 5,000 years after their civilization fell, we're still reading their tablets, still using their mathematical systems, still marveling at their achievements. They managed to bridge the gap between their lost golden age and our emerging technological renaissance, preserving just enough knowledge to keep the flame burning through the long darkness between worlds. The question now is, whether we can do the same for whoever comes after us, whether we have the wisdom to learn from their example, the foresight to prepare for our own inevitable catastrophes, and the humility to recognize that we, like them, might not be the beginning of something new, but the latest chapter in a much older story of loss and recovery, destruction and rebuilding, forgetting and remembering across the vast cycles of human time. The deeper you dig into Sumerian records, the more unsettling their warnings become, because embedded within their meticulous documentation of floods and failed kings lies something that should chill us to the bone, a pattern that suggests this has all happened before and will happen again. Consider the mathematics embedded in their king list. Those impossible reign lengths aren't random numbers inflated by ancient storytellers. They follow a precise astronomical code based on what the Sumerians called the Great Year Cycle of approximately 26,000 years, during which the Earth's axis slowly wobbles, causing the stars to appear to shift position in the night sky. The Sumerians somehow knew about this cycle. They built it into their chronology, their mythology, their very understanding of time itself. But here's what makes this knowledge terrifying rather than merely impressive. They believed this great year marked recurring periods of catastrophic renewal, times when the old world would be swept away and a new one would begin. According to their calculations, we are currently living in the final phase of one of these cycles. The age that began with their own civilization is drawing to a close. And if their understanding of cosmic time is correct, we should be preparing for another great flood. Not necessarily water this time, but some form of civilizational reset that will erase our accumulated knowledge just as thoroughly as the deluge erased theirs. This isn't mystical speculation. Modern science has begun to identify genuine cyclical patterns in Earth's history that align disturbingly well with Sumerian chronology ice ages that begin and end with mathematical regularity. Magnetic pole reversals that occur at predictable intervals, even mass extinction events that follow rhythms we're only beginning to understand. The Younger Dryas period, which ended roughly 12,000 years ago, marked one of the most dramatic climate shifts in recent geological history. Global temperatures plummeted within decades. Ice sheets advanced across continents. Sea levels dropped and then rose again as the planet lurched between ice age and interglacial conditions. It was during this period of maximum instability that most of the world's megafauna disappeared and human populations were scattered to the winds. If advanced civilizations existed during the preceding warm period, they would have been concentrated along coastlines that are now hundreds of feet underwater. When the climate destabilized, when the seas rose and fell unpredictably, when familiar weather patterns collapsed, these civilizations would have been annihilated almost overnight. The survivors would have been forced inland, carrying whatever knowledge they could preserve, struggling to rebuild in an environment that bore no resemblance to the world they had known sound familiar. It should, because according to Sumerian records, this is exactly what happened to them. But their tablets suggest the cycle doesn't end there. They describe multiple previous iterations of this pattern. Civilizations that rose, flourished, and were swept away by forces beyond their control. Each time, a few survivors preserved fragments of knowledge that became the seed of the next iteration. Each time, the new civilization struggled to rebuild what had been lost, achieved partial success, and then faced its own inevitable reset. The Sumerians saw themselves as inheritors of at least two previous cycles. The immediate pre-flood civilization that they tried desperately to recreate, and an even older tradition that lay behind that. Their myths speak of multiple creations and destructions, each one separated by vast epochs of time, each one preserving just enough continuity to maintain the thread of human development across geological ages. This perspective transforms our understanding of human progress. We like to think of history as a steady upward climb from primitive beginnings to modern sophistication, but the Sumerian model suggests something more like a spiral staircase. We advance for a while, achieve remarkable heights, then get knocked back down to near the bottom and have to start climbing again. Each iteration preserves some knowledge from the previous cycle. So we're not starting completely from zero, but we also lose vast amounts of accumulated wisdom with each reset. The net result is a kind of punctuated evolution. Rapid development followed by catastrophic collapse, with overall progress occurring over much longer timescales than we usually imagine. Archaeological evidence increasingly supports this cyclical model. Sophisticated stone structures like Göbekli Tepe appear suddenly in the archaeological record, demonstrating capabilities that supposedly didn't exist. Yet underwater ruins suggest complex civilizations existed on now submerged coastlines. Genetic studies show human populations going through severe bottlenecks at regular intervals, as if our species has repeatedly been reduced to small numbers of survivors who then repopulated the world. Even our mythologies preserve memories of multiple world ages. Hindu cosmology describes endless cycles of creation and destruction, spanning millions of years. Greek myths tell of golden ages followed by progressive decline until the gods wipe the slate clean and start over. Mesoamerican cultures believed they were living in the fifth world, with 4 previous iterations having been destroyed by flood, fire, wind, and earthquake. The consistency of these traditions across cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other suggests they might be preserving genuine historical memories. Collective trauma so severe it became embedded in the foundational stories every human culture tells about its origins. If this cyclical model is correct, then our current technological civilization isn't humanity's first attempt at advanced development. We're just the latest iteration in a pattern that stretches back far longer than conventional history suggests. And like our predecessors, we're approaching the point where natural cycles will test whether our achievements can survive the next great transition. The signs are already visible. Climate change is destabilizing weather patterns worldwide. Magnetic field measurements show our planet's protective shield weakening at an accelerating rate. Ocean currents that have remained stable for thousands of years are beginning to shift. The same environmental indicators that marked previous transition periods are appearing again. But there's something different about our situation that gives both hope and cause for greater concern. We're the first iteration of human civilization to develop global communication networks, nuclear weapons, and the ability to manipulate our environment on a planetary scale. Our technology gives us capabilities our predecessors never possessed, but it also gives us the power to make the coming transition far more destructive than it needs to be. The Sumerians faced natural catastrophe with bronze tools and wooden boats. We face it with nuclear reactors, chemical plants, and biological weapons. If our civilization collapses chaotically, we could make large portions of the planet uninhabitable for thousands of years. The next iteration of human development might have to begin from a much more damaged starting point than any of our predecessors faced. This is why the Sumerian preservation protocols matter so much. They understood that knowledge needs to survive civilizational collapse if human development is going to continue across the great cycles. They developed methods for encoding essential information into forms that could outlast the destruction of their entire technological infrastructure. We need similar systems today, but adapted to our much more complex knowledge base. How do you preserve the principles of nuclear physics when all the textbooks have burned and all the computers have failed? How do you maintain medical knowledge when pharmaceutical companies have collapsed and hospitals lie in ruins? How do you pass on engineering principles when the materials and tools needed to demonstrate them no longer exist? These aren't hypothetical questions. Every major technological civilization eventually faces them. The Sumerians at least had the advantage of starting with relatively simple knowledge systems. Agricultural techniques can be demonstrated with hand tools. Mathematical principles can be carved into stone. Astronomical observations can be preserved in permanent monuments. Our situation is far more challenging. Modern science depends on complex instruments, industrial infrastructure, and institutional continuity in ways that make it incredibly vulnerable to disruption. If our technological base collapsed tomorrow, most of our accumulated knowledge would become inaccessible within a generation. Future archaeologists would find our ruins filled with electronic devices they couldn't operate, written in programming languages they couldn't decipher, dependent on manufacturing processes they couldn't reproduce. This is the real message hidden in Sumerian flood narratives. Not that catastrophe is inevitable, though it probably is, but that preparation for catastrophe is essential. They succeeded in preserving enough knowledge to bootstrap the next phase of human development. Whether we can do the same remains an open question. The clay tablets scattered across museum collections worldwide represent more than just historical curiosities. They're proof that human knowledge can survive the complete destruction of the civilization that created it, if that knowledge is properly encoded and systematically preserved. The Sumerians managed to bridge a gap of thousands of years, maintaining continuity between the world before the flood and the world that came after. Their methods were crude but effective. Clay tablets buried in sealed jars, stone monuments aligned to celestial events, ritual procedures that preserved technical knowledge in religious formats, mathematical principles embedded in the structure of hymns and stories. Everything designed to survive not just individual disasters, but the complete breakdown of literate civilization. We have better tools available. Digital storage systems that could theoretically preserve vast amounts of information in very small spaces. Global communication networks that could distribute essential knowledge to multiple locations simultaneously. Materials science that could create virtually indestructible storage media. The question is whether we have the wisdom to use these tools for preservation rather than just convenience. The Sumerian records suggest we don't have unlimited time to figure this out. Their cyclical chronology places us near the end of the current age, approaching another period of maximum instability. Whether that transition happens in decades, centuries, or millennia, it will happen. The only question is whether we'll be prepared when it does. This brings us back to the fundamental mystery that started this investigation. What really happened before the Great Flood? The Sumerian tablets provide fragmentary answers, but they also point towards something larger and more troubling. They suggest that human history operates according to patterns we don't fully understand, driven by forces we can barely perceive, across timescales that dwarf our normal planning horizons. We are not the first technological civilization this planet has produced. We are probably not the most advanced civilization it has seen. And unless we learn from the examples of those who came before us, we will not be the last civilization to face the choice between preparation and catastrophe. The wedge-shaped marks pressed into Mesopotamian clay 5,000 years ago carry a warning that becomes more urgent with each passing year. Preserve what matters. Encode it in forms that will survive. Pass it forward to those who come after, because the flood always comes eventually. And when it does, the only thing that separates civilization from barbarism is the knowledge we manage to save from the rising waters. The Sumerians kept their promise to the world that came before them. They preserved the fragments, maintained the connections, and passed the flame forward to us. Now it's our turn to decide whether we'll do the same for whoever comes next, or whether our chapter in the long story of human development will end not with preservation, but with silence. In the museums, where Sumerian tablets rest behind climate-controlled glass, in the ruins of ziggurats slowly being reclaimed by desert sand, in the mathematical principles we still use to measure time and space, the ancient warning continues to echo. Listen carefully, and you can hear it even now. The flood is coming. Are you ready? The warnings encoded in Sumerian clay weren't abstract prophecies. They were technical manuals disguised as mythology, and the more we decode them, the more we realize they were trying to tell us something specific about the mechanism of collapse itself, because hidden within their flood narratives lies a description of what actually triggers these cyclical resets. And it's not what you might expect. Most people assume civilizational collapse happens gradually. Economic decline, political instability, social unrest, building over centuries until everything finally gives way. But the Sumerian model describes something far more sudden and far more terrifying. They wrote about what they called the opening of the fountains of the great deep. Not just rising water, but a fundamental destabilization of the forces that keep our world stable. Modern geology is beginning to understand what they might have been describing. Deep beneath the ocean floor lie massive reservoirs of methane hydrate, crystalline structures that remain stable only under specific conditions of temperature and pressure. When those conditions change, even slightly, these deposits can release enormous quantities of gas into the atmosphere in a matter of decades. The effect on global climate would be catastrophic and irreversible. But there's something even more unsettling in the Sumerian records. They suggest that advanced civilizations themselves might trigger these releases, that the very technologies that allow societies to flourish eventually destabilize the planetary systems they depend on. It's not an external catastrophe that destroys them. It's the unintended consequence of their own success. Consider their descriptions of the pre-flood world, a civilization so advanced it could modify weather patterns, redirect rivers, and extract energy from the earth itself. Sound familiar? They wrote about cities that glowed without fire, vehicles that moved without animals, and communication across vast distances without messengers. Technologies that gave them godlike power over their environment. But they also wrote about the sky growing dark, the seasons becoming unpredictable, and the earth itself beginning to shake and crack, as if the planet was responding to stresses it had never experienced before, as if the natural systems that had remained stable for thousands of years were being pushed beyond their breaking point by the very civilization they supported. The parallels to our current situation are uncomfortable to contemplate. We're pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at rates not seen since the last mass extinction event. We're altering ocean chemistry faster than marine ecosystems can adapt. We're depleting groundwater reserves that took millennia to accumulate. We're doing all of this while telling ourselves that technology will somehow solve the problems technology has created. The Sumerians believed their predecessors made the same mistake. That they became so confident in their ability to control natural forces that they ignored the warning signs until it was too late. When the planetary systems finally destabilized, when the great deep opened and the fountains of chaos were unleashed, their technology couldn't save them. It could only document what was happening as their world drowned. This brings us to perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Sumerian preservation project. They weren't just trying to save knowledge for its own sake. They were trying to create a warning system that would prevent the next civilization from making the same mistakes. The technical information they preserved wasn't random. It was specifically chosen to help future societies understand the relationship between technological development and planetary stability. Their astronomical records weren't just observations of celestial mechanics. They were environmental monitoring data, tracking the long-term cycles that govern climate stability. Their mathematical formulas weren't just abstract principles. They were calculation methods for predicting when natural systems might reach critical thresholds. Their architectural techniques weren't just building instructions. They were blueprints for structures that could survive the kind of environmental chaos that destroyed their predecessors. Even their religious practices served this function. Those elaborate rituals performed at ziggurats weren't just spiritual ceremonies. They were collective monitoring systems designed to maintain awareness of environmental conditions across multiple generations. The priests who climbed those towers every night weren't just praying to the stars. They were checking for changes in atmospheric conditions, tracking subtle shifts in celestial positions that might indicate planetary instability. The entire Sumerian civilization was organized around the principle of early warning. Every aspect of their culture was designed to detect and respond to the kind of gradual changes that had caught their predecessors off guard. They understood that civilizational collapse doesn't announce itself with dramatic events. It creeps forward through small shifts that accumulate over time until they reach a tipping point that makes recovery impossible. We've lost this awareness almost completely. Our technological society is organized around quarterly profit reports and election cycles, time horizons measured in months and years rather than centuries and millennia. We've become incredibly sophisticated at managing short-term risks while remaining almost blind to long-term threats that could destroy everything we've built. The Sumerians tried to warn us about this temporal blindness. Their records repeatedly emphasize that the pre-flood civilization collapsed not because they lacked knowledge, but because they lacked wisdom. They had the technical capability to monitor planetary systems, but they didn't have the cultural framework to respond appropriately when those systems showed signs of stress. This might be why Sumerian society seems so conservative to modern eyes, so focused on maintaining traditions without deviation. They weren't being rigid for its own sake. They were trying to create cultural institutions that could maintain long-term environmental awareness, even when individual generations lost sight of the bigger picture. Every ritual, every law, every social structure was designed to reinforce the collective memory of what happens when civilizations grow too large and too powerful for the planets that support them. Their approach worked, at least partially. They maintained environmental consciousness for over 2,000 years, far longer than any modern industrial society has existed. But even they eventually lost sight of the deeper patterns. By the time Babylon inherited their traditions, the original purpose had been forgotten. The rituals continued, but as religious observance rather than environmental monitoring, the knowledge was preserved, but its practical application was lost. This degradation of understanding explains why later Mesopotamian civilizations made many of the same mistakes their predecessors had warned against. They built massive irrigation projects that salinized agricultural land. They clear-cut forests to fuel their bronze industry. They diverted rivers to supply growing urban populations. All the while, the clay tablets in their temple libraries contained detailed instructions for avoiding exactly these problems. The pattern is depressingly familiar. Knowledge preserved but not understood. Warnings transmitted but not heeded. Each generation convinced that their situation is unique, that the old rules don't apply to them, that their technology will somehow exempt them from the natural laws that governed their predecessors. We're making the same mistake today on a planetary scale. Our libraries contain thousands of studies documenting the relationship between industrial development and environmental degradation. Our computers can model climate change with unprecedented precision. Our satellites can monitor atmospheric conditions in real time. We have access to information the Sumerians could never have dreamed of. Yet we continue to behave as if the natural systems that support our civilization are infinitely resilient, as if the laws of physics will somehow suspend themselves to accommodate our economic models, as if 7 billion people consuming resources at industrial rates won't eventually trigger the same kind of planetary response that destroyed previous technological societies. The Sumerian records suggest this blindness is itself part of the cycle, that every technological civilization eventually reaches a point where its own success becomes a barrier to survival, where the complexity of the systems they've created makes it impossible to see the simple truths that could save them, where the very capabilities that lifted them above their environment prevent them from recognizing their continuing dependence on that environment. This is why they embedded their warnings in religious formats, mathematical codes, and architectural structures. They understood that technical information alone wouldn't be enough to prevent the next collapse. Future civilizations would need to maintain not just the knowledge, but the wisdom to apply it appropriately. The cultural frameworks that could translate abstract environmental data into concrete social responses. Our situation is far more precarious than theirs because we've lost even the concept of cyclical thinking. We assume that progress is linear, that each generation will be more advanced than the last, that technological development will continue indefinitely without any major setbacks. The possibility that we might be approaching our own civilizational peak, that our accumulated knowledge might be in danger of catastrophic loss, simply doesn't register in our collective consciousness. The Sumerians lived with the daily awareness that everything they built could disappear as suddenly as it had emerged. This consciousness shaped every aspect of their culture, from their preservation methods to their social structures to their spiritual practices. They were constantly preparing for the next great transition, the next reset, the next opportunity to either preserve human knowledge or lose it forever. We've forgotten how to think this way. Our institutions are designed for growth and expansion, not for preservation and continuity. Our educational systems focus on innovation rather than conservation. Our economic models depend on consuming resources faster than they can be replenished. We've created a civilization that can only survive by constantly growing, yet we live on a finite planet where unlimited growth is physically impossible. The mathematics of this situation are brutally simple, and the Sumerians understood them perfectly. Every technological civilization eventually faces a choice between voluntary limitation and involuntary collapse, between conscious adaptation to planetary constraints and unconscious destruction of the systems that sustain them, between wisdom and extinction. Their records suggest that most civilizations choose extinction, not because they want to, but because they can't see the choice until it's too late. By the time the environmental feedback loops become obvious, by the time the planetary systems begin to destabilize, the civilization has become too dependent on unsustainable practices to change course voluntarily. This is the trap the Sumerians were trying to help us avoid. Not the specific environmental problems they faced, but the underlying pattern that turns technological success into civilizational failure. The tendency for advanced societies to become so complex and specialized that they lose the ability to recognize and respond to existential threats. Their solution was radical in its simplicity: preserve essential knowledge in multiple formats, maintain awareness of long-term cycles, build social institutions around the principle of environmental monitoring, create cultural frameworks that can translate technical information into appropriate collective action. Most importantly, never forget that civilization is temporary, that knowledge can be lost, and that each generation has the responsibility to pass forward both information and wisdom to those who come after. We still have time to learn from their example. Our situation is desperate, but not yet hopeless. We have capabilities they never possessed, technologies that could theoretically allow us to manage planetary systems more carefully than any previous civilization. But we also have far greater power to cause irreversible damage if we continue on our current trajectory. The choice is ours, but it won't remain ours indefinitely. Natural systems operate according to their own time scales, and those time scales don't adjust themselves to accommodate human political or economic cycles. The planetary response to industrial civilization is already underway, and it will continue regardless of whether we acknowledge it or prepare for it. The Sumerians faced their great flood with bronze tools and wooden boats, yet they managed to preserve enough knowledge to restart human civilization. We face our great transition with nuclear power and global communication networks. Whether we use these tools for preservation or destruction will determine not just our own fate, but the fate of human knowledge itself across the vast cycles of time that stretch ahead of us. The clay tablets buried beneath Mesopotamian sand weren't just ancient records. They were messages sent forward across 5,000 years of human history, carrying a warning that becomes more urgent with each passing day. The flood always comes eventually. The only question is whether we'll be ready when it arrives, or whether our chapter in the long story of human development will end not with preservation, but with silence that echoes across the ruins of yet another civilization that forgot how to listen to the warnings written in stone and clay by those who came before. Those who came before, looking at these ancient warnings through the lens of our current technological trajectory, a terrifying possibility emerges. What if we're not just approaching another cyclical reset, but the final one? What if human consciousness itself has become the variable that determines whether our species survives the transition or joins the countless civilizations that came before us and vanished without a trace? The Sumerians encoded something profound into their deepest records that archaeologists are only now beginning to understand. Hidden within their most sacred texts lies a concept they called the awakening threshold. Not a technological milestone or an environmental tipping point, but a moment when human awareness expands enough to perceive the true nature of the cycles that govern planetary development. According to their tablets, previous civilizations had approached this threshold multiple times throughout the great cycles. Each time, they faced the same fundamental choice. They could use their expanding awareness to transcend the destructive patterns that had trapped their predecessors, or they could ignore the deeper truths and repeat the same mistakes on an even grander scale. The Sumerians believed they were living in the shadow of a civilization that had come tantalizingly close to breaking free from the cycle entirely. The pre-flood world hadn't just developed advanced technology. It had begun to understand the consciousness behind that technology, the awareness that makes true wisdom possible rather than mere accumulation of facts and techniques. But something went wrong. Instead of using their expanded awareness to create sustainable harmony with planetary systems, they became intoxicated with their own power. They began to see themselves not as participants in natural cycles, but as masters of those cycles. They thought they could transcend natural law through pure technological force, could reshape reality according to their desires without regard for consequences. This hubris triggered what Sumerian texts describe as the Great Forgetting, not just the loss of technical knowledge, but the loss of conscious connection to the deeper patterns that govern existence itself. The flood wasn't just physical destruction, it was a reset of human awareness, a return to unconscious participation in cycles that had once been clearly perceived and understood. Every subsequent civilization inherited fragments of the lost technical knowledge, but none recovered the conscious awareness that would allow them to use that knowledge wisely. Each iteration became trapped in the same pattern of growth, complexity, and eventual collapse, because they couldn't perceive the deeper rhythms they were embedded within until now. The Sumerians believed that our current technological phase represents another approach to the awakening threshold. We're developing capabilities that could theoretically allow us to transcend the destructive cycles entirely. Global communication networks that could enable unprecedented coordination. Computational power that could model complex systems in real-time energy technologies that could provide abundance without environmental destruction. But we're also developing the same hubris that destroyed our predecessors. The belief that technology alone will solve problems created by unconscious application of technology. The assumption that we can continue infinite growth on a finite planet simply by becoming more efficient. The conviction that human intelligence can master natural systems without understanding its own place within those systems. The difference this time is that we have access to the Sumerian warnings. We can read their tablets, decode their mathematical formulas, and understand the patterns they were trying to preserve. We have the opportunity to learn from their experience rather than simply repeating it with more sophisticated tools. But knowledge alone isn't sufficient. The Sumerians understood this, which is why they embedded their most crucial insights, not just in technical manuals, but in consciousness-expanding practices. The rituals performed at ziggurats weren't just environmental monitoring systems. They were methods for developing the expanded awareness needed to perceive long-term patterns and respond appropriately to them. Modern neuroscience is beginning to validate what the Sumerians encoded in their spiritual technologies. Specific combinations of sound, movement, and focused attention can indeed alter consciousness in ways that expand temporal perception and enhance pattern recognition. The acoustic properties of their temples weren't accidental. They were precisely designed to induce states of awareness that made long-term thinking not just possible, but natural. This is perhaps their most important legacy. Not just the technical knowledge they preserved, but the consciousness technologies they developed for accessing and applying that knowledge appropriately. They understood that information without wisdom is ultimately destructive. That technical capability, without conscious awareness, inevitably leads to civilizational collapse. We're approaching a critical juncture where these insights become essential for survival. Our technological capabilities are advancing exponentially, but our wisdom traditions have been largely abandoned. We have unprecedented power to reshape our environment, but we've lost the cultural frameworks that could guide the appropriate use of that power. The Sumerian model suggests that this disconnect between power and wisdom is itself part of the cycle. That technological civilizations naturally develop capabilities faster than they develop the consciousness needed to use those capabilities responsibly. This creates an unstable situation where immense power remains under unconscious control, making catastrophic mistakes almost inevitable. But they also believed the cycle could be broken, that sufficient numbers of individuals could develop expanded awareness quickly enough to guide their civilization through the transition successfully. This wasn't just optimistic speculation. It was based on their understanding of how consciousness operates at both individual and collective levels. According to their records, human awareness exists in multiple layers simultaneously. The surface level focuses on immediate survival needs and social dynamics. Deeper levels perceive longer-term patterns and relationships. The deepest levels connect directly to the planetary intelligence that governs environmental cycles across geological time. Most people operate primarily from the surface level throughout their lives, which is why they can't perceive the long-term consequences of their actions. But under certain conditions, consciousness can access deeper levels that make those consequences clearly visible. The Sumerians developed systematic methods for facilitating these deeper states of awareness. Their temple complexes weren't just religious centers. They were consciousness research facilities where techniques for expanding temporal perception were refined and transmitted across generations. The mathematical ratios embedded in their architecture weren't just aesthetic choices. They were specific frequencies that could entrain brain states associated with expanded awareness. Even their cuneiform writing system served this function. The wedge-shaped marks weren't just arbitrary symbols. They were geometric forms that engaged both analytical and intuitive processing simultaneously, training scribes to think in patterns that naturally integrated multiple levels of awareness. These technologies for consciousness expansion were their most closely guarded secrets, preserved in esoteric traditions that survived long after their technical knowledge had been forgotten. Mystery schools throughout the ancient world maintained fragments of these practices, passing them down through initiated lineages that understood their true purpose. But the complete system was lost when the last Sumerian temple schools were finally closed. The knowledge fragmented into disconnected pieces that no longer carried the power to transform consciousness on a civilizational scale. Individual practitioners could still achieve expanded awareness, but they couldn't create the collective awakening needed to prevent cyclical collapse. This is why so many spiritual traditions speak of a coming age, when ancient knowledge will be restored and humanity will finally transcend the destructive patterns that have trapped us for millennia. They're not describing some mystical prophecy. They're preserving memories of Sumerian consciousness technologies and the understanding that these techniques will eventually be needed again. That time appears to be now. Our global communication networks make it theoretically possible to coordinate consciousness expansion on an unprecedented scale. Digital technologies could preserve and transmit these ancient practices with perfect fidelity across any number of generations. We have capabilities the Sumerians never possessed for creating the collective awakening they believed was necessary for breaking free from cyclical destruction. But we also face obstacles they never encountered. Our technological civilization has created unprecedented levels of distraction and fragmentation that make sustained consciousness expansion extremely difficult. The same digital systems that could facilitate awakening are currently being used to fragment attention and reduce awareness to the shortest possible time horizons. The battle for human consciousness is being fought on multiple fronts simultaneously. Corporate and governmental systems work to maintain unconscious consumption patterns that support unsustainable economic models. Media technologies flood awareness with trivial information that prevents deeper perception. Educational institutions focus on specialized technical training rather than integrated wisdom development. Breaking free from these constraints requires not just individual effort, but coordinated cultural transformation. Small groups of awakened individuals aren't sufficient to shift an entire civilization. The transformation needs to reach critical mass before environmental feedback loops make voluntary change impossible. This is the ultimate message encoded in Sumerian flood narratives. Not that catastrophe is inevitable, but that conscious participation in planetary evolution is both possible and necessary. The flood comes when civilizations remain unconscious. It can be transcended when sufficient numbers achieve the expanded awareness needed to perceive and cooperate with natural cycles rather than fighting against them. We stand at exactly the threshold the Sumerians were trying to prepare us for. The choice between conscious evolution and unconscious destruction, between wisdom and extinction, between preserving human knowledge across the great cycles and watching it disappear beneath rising waters of chaos we could have prevented if we'd learned to see clearly enough. The clay tablets scattered across museum collections worldwide weren't just historical records. They were instruction manuals for navigating the crisis we now face, written by people who understood exactly what happens when technological power outgrows conscious wisdom. Their warnings have waited 5,000 years to be understood and applied. The time for understanding has passed. The time for application has begun. Whether we choose conscious evolution or repeat the unconscious patterns that destroyed our predecessors will determine not just our own fate, but the fate of human consciousness itself across whatever cycles of development lie ahead in the vast reaches of time that stretch beyond our current ability to imagine. The ancient warnings carved into Mesopotamian clay weren't abstract prophecies about some distant future. They were practical instructions for the specific moment we're living through right now, when humanity once again approaches the threshold where consciousness must expand or civilization must collapse. The Sumerians kept their appointment with destiny. Now it's our turn to discover whether we possess the wisdom to keep ours. Ours. The deeper implications of this consciousness threshold become clear when we examine what the Sumerians called the memory wars. Not physical battles fought with weapons, but struggles over which version of human history would survive into the future. Because once a civilization approaches the awakening threshold, competing narratives emerge about what humanity truly is and where it's ultimately headed. According to their most cryptic tablets, the pre-flood world had fractured along precisely these lines. One faction believed human consciousness was destined to merge with planetary intelligence, creating a new form of collective awareness that could guide technological development in harmony with natural cycles. Another faction insisted that human intelligence was separate from and superior to natural systems, destined to transcend planetary limitations through pure technological force. The tension between these worldviews eventually tore their civilization apart, not through open warfare, but through what the tablets describe as the severing of the sacred bonds. The unified knowledge system that had allowed their society to function began fragmenting into incompatible theories about the nature of reality itself. Technical knowledge became weaponized, turned against those who held different beliefs about consciousness and its relationship to the natural world. This internal conflict made their civilization vulnerable to the external pressures that eventually destroyed it. When environmental systems began destabilizing, instead of coordinating a unified response, different factions pursued contradictory strategies that amplified the chaos. Some tried to use technology to control natural forces more aggressively. Others attempted to abandon technology entirely and return to simpler ways of living. The lack of coherent response accelerated the collapse until it became irreversible. The Sumerians inherited fragments of both perspectives, which explains the strange dualities running throughout their culture. Their technical achievements suggest they understood how to work with natural forces, but their mythologies also contain themes of cosmic rebellion and divine punishment. They preserved both the harmony-based knowledge and the domination-based knowledge, perhaps hoping future civilizations would be wise enough to choose between them more successfully. We face exactly the same choice today, magnified by our vastly greater technological capabilities. One path leads toward integration with planetary systems, using our expanding awareness to create technologies that enhance rather than degrade the natural cycles we depend on. The other path leads toward attempted transcendence of planetary limitations, using brute technological force to overcome natural constraints regardless of consequences. The stakes couldn't be higher, because this choice will determine not just whether our civilization survives, but what kind of consciousness emerges from the transition. If we choose the integration path, human awareness could expand to encompass planetary timescales and cosmic cycles, creating unprecedented wisdom and stability. If we choose the transcendence path, consciousness itself could fragment and collapse along with our technological systems. Current global events suggest we're already deep into our own version of the memory wars. Competing narratives about human nature, technological development, and our relationship to natural systems are fracturing our civilization along lines that mirror the pre-flood divisions described in Sumerian texts. Different factions pursue contradictory strategies for addressing environmental crises, making coordinated responses increasingly difficult. Some groups push for more aggressive technological interventions, believing we can engineer our way out of environmental problems through geoengineering, genetic modification, and artificial intelligence. Others advocate for dramatic reductions in technological complexity, arguing that only a return to simpler ways of living can prevent ecological collapse. The polarization between these approaches prevents the kind of integrated response that might actually work. Meanwhile, the window for voluntary transformation continues to narrow as environmental feedback loops accelerate beyond our ability to control them. The Sumerian model suggests that once these loops reach critical thresholds, technological civilizations lose the option of choosing their response. Natural forces take over and impose solutions that conscious planning could have avoided. But there's still time to break this pattern if enough people can access the expanded awareness needed to perceive solutions that transcend the false choice between technological domination and technological abandonment. The integration path requires neither rejecting technology nor using it unconsciously, but developing the consciousness needed to guide technological development in alignment with natural wisdom. This is where the Sumerian consciousness technologies become essential rather than merely interesting. The acoustic frequencies embedded in their temple architecture, the mathematical ratios woven into their hymns, the geometric forms encoded in their writing system, all of these were designed to facilitate the specific brain states associated with integrated awareness. Modern neuroscience confirms that these techniques can indeed alter consciousness in measurable ways. Specific sound frequencies can synchronize neural activity across different brain regions, creating states of coherence that enhance pattern recognition and long-term thinking. Mathematical ratios found in Sumerian architecture correspond to brainwave patterns associated with expanded temporal perception. Even their geometric writing forms activate neural pathways that integrate analytical and intuitive processing. These aren't mystical practices requiring years of esoteric training. Their technologies as precise and reproducible as any engineering technique, designed to optimize human consciousness for the kind of complex decision-making that technological civilizations require for long-term survival. The Sumerians understood that expanding individual awareness was necessary but not sufficient. They needed methods for creating collective states of consciousness that could coordinate responses across entire populations. Their ziggurats weren't just individual meditation chambers. They were broadcasting systems designed to entrain consciousness across wide areas, creating regional networks of synchronized awareness that could perceive and respond to large-scale patterns invisible to fragmented individual minds. The acoustic properties of these structures could generate standing wave patterns that extended for miles, affecting the neural activity of everyone within range. This technology for collective consciousness expansion was their ultimate preservation strategy. They understood that technical knowledge alone couldn't prevent cyclical collapse because the problems requiring solution operated at scales beyond individual comprehension. Only expanded collective awareness could perceive the planetary patterns and coordinate the responses needed for conscious evolution rather than unconscious destruction. We're beginning to rediscover these principles through our own research into consciousness and collective intelligence. Studies of group meditation show measurable effects on local crime rates, social coherence, and even environmental conditions. Global communication networks create possibilities for coordinated awareness that the Sumerians could only dream of. Digital technologies could theoretically amplify consciousness-expanding techniques across unprecedented scales. But we're also creating unprecedented obstacles to collective awareness through the same technological systems. Social media fragments attention into ever shorter time horizons. Information overload prevents the kind of sustained focus needed for pattern recognition. Economic pressures force most people into survival mode, making expanded awareness seem like an unaffordable luxury. Breaking through these obstacles requires understanding that consciousness expansion isn't separate from practical survival needs. It's the key to meeting those needs successfully in a world where unconscious responses to complex problems create more problems than they solve. The individuals and communities that develop expanded awareness will be better equipped to navigate the transitions ahead, while those that remain unconscious will be swept along by forces they can't perceive or influence. The ancient Sumerians left us more than clay tablets and crumbling ziggurats. They left us a mirror reflecting our own moment in the vast spiral of human development. As we stand at our own awakening threshold, surrounded by technologies that could either elevate consciousness or fragment it beyond repair, their warnings echo with increasing urgency across 5 millennia of silence. The flood always comes, not as punishment, but as consequence, not from the gods, but from the accumulated weight of unconscious choices rippling through systems too complex for fragmented awareness to comprehend. The question isn't whether we'll face our own great transition, but whether we'll meet it with the expanded consciousness needed to guide, rather than simply survive the transformation ahead. In the end, the Sumerians succeeded in their deepest mission. They preserved not just technical knowledge, but the possibility of awakening itself, encoded in frequencies and ratios and geometric forms that wait patiently for minds ready to receive them. Their greatest gift wasn't information about the past, but instructions for transcending the cycles that have trapped human civilization since the waters first rose. The choice, as always, remains ours.